Picture this. A man who's never known a woman's touch, living alone in the wilderness. A woman written off by society, resigned to spinsterhood. One fateful night in a dusty frontier town changes everything. This is the story of how two lonely souls found each other in the most unexpected way. Proving that love doesn't follow society's rules, it writes its own. If you love stories of unexpected romance and second chances, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The autumn of 1887 painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and crimson, but for Tom McKenzie, the beauty of the season felt as distant as the stars. At 28, he stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of swinging an axe, his calloused hands telling the story of a man who knew only the language of hard work. His cabin, nestled deep in the pine forests outside the town of Cedar Ridge, had been his sanctuary for the past 5 years, a place where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through branches and the occasional crack of settling timber. Tom had come west after his parents died of fever back in Ohio, carrying nothing but his father's tools and a heart heavy with grief. The solitude had been a balm at first, but as the years passed it had become a prison of his own making. He'd grown comfortable in his isolation, perhaps too comfortable. The few times he ventured into town for supplies, he kept his eyes down, his words few, his interactions brief. Women, especially, seemed like creatures from another world, beautiful, mysterious, and utterly beyond his understanding. Meanwhile, in the heart of Cedar Ridge, Eleanor Hartwell swept the front porch of her small boarding house with the same methodical precision she applied to everything in her 32-year-old life. The townspeople had long since stopped seeing her as anything more than a fixture, reliable. Practical Ellie who kept clean rooms and served hot meals, but who had somehow missed her chance at marriage and motherhood. Ellie had inherited the boarding house from her aunt 3 years prior, along with the reputation of being the town's confirmed spinster. At 32, she was considered well past her prime in a society that valued women primarily for their ability to bear children and tend to husbands. Her auburn hair, which she kept severely pinned back, had begun showing threads of silver at the temples. Her green eyes, once bright with dreams, had settled into a resigned acceptance of her fate. But beneath her practical exterior, Ellie harbored secrets. She read romance novels by candlelight, dreaming of passionate embraces and whispered declarations of love. She watched the young couples in town with a mixture of longing and bitterness, wondering what it might feel like to be desired, to be chosen, to be loved with abandon. The boarding house provided her with purpose and independence, rare commodities for a woman in her position. She took pride in her work, in the way she could stretch a dollar and make travelers feel at home. But as she watched the sun set each evening from her kitchen window, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, she couldn't shake the feeling that life was passing her by. It was on a particularly crisp October evening that fate decided to intervene. Tom had come to town for his monthly supply run, his wagon loaded with the lumber he'd cut and prepared for sale. The general store was closed by the time he finished his business, and the saloon, well, the saloon had never been his kind of place. He found himself standing in the dusty main street, uncertain where to spend the night. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, noticed his predicament. "You look lost, young man," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing other people's affairs. Tom removed his worn hat, his dark hair falling across his forehead. "Yes, ma'am. I was hoping to find a place to stay the night. The hotel seems to be full up." "Oh, that's because of the cattle drive that came through this afternoon," Mrs. Patterson explained. "But Miss Hartwell runs a clean boarding house just down the street. She'll have a room for you." "I'm sure." As Tom walked toward the modest 2-story building with its hand-painted sign reading Hartwell House, he had no idea that this simple decision would change the course of his life forever. Ellie was in her kitchen, kneading dough for tomorrow's breakfast biscuits, when she heard the knock at her front door. Wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, she made her way through the small parlor, wondering who might be calling at such an hour. When she opened the door, she found herself looking up at a man unlike any who had ever stood on her threshold. Tom McKenzie was ruggedly handsome, in a way that spoke of honest work and clean living. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, his boots worn but polished. There was something in his dark eyes, a shyness perhaps, or a vulnerability, that immediately set him apart from the rough cowboys and traveling salesmen who usually sought her rooms. "Ma'am," Tom said, his voice deep and slightly uncertain. "I was told you might have a room available for the night." Ellie felt her heart skip in a way it hadn't in years. "Of course," she managed, stepping aside to let him enter. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell, but most folks call me Ellie, Tom McKenzie," he replied, removing his hat again. "I appreciate the kindness, Miss Hartwell," as she led him up the narrow staircase to the only available room, her best room. She realized with a start, Ellie found herself acutely aware of his presence behind her. She could smell the clean scent of pine and honest sweat, could hear the careful way he placed his feet on the wooden steps, as if afraid his weight might damage something. "Here we are," she said, opening the door to reveal a simply furnished but spotlessly clean room. "Breakfast is served at 7, but I can have something ready earlier if you need to be on your way." Tom set his small traveling bag on the chair by the window and turned to face her. In the lamplight, Ellie noticed the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands, large and capable, handled his hat with surprising gentleness. "7 will be fine," he said. "I'm not in any particular hurry." There was something in the way he said it, a loneliness that echoed her own, that made Ellie linger in the doorway longer than propriety dictated. "Well then," she said finally, "I'll let you get settled. Good night, Mr. Mackenzie. Good night, Miss Hartwell." "And thank you." As Ellie made her way back downstairs, she found her hands trembling slightly as she returned to her biscuit dough. There had been something in that brief exchange, something electric and unexpected, that had awakened feelings she'd thought long buried. She told herself it was foolishness, a lonely woman reading too much into a simple business transaction, but as she worked the dough with perhaps more vigor than necessary, she couldn't shake the image of Tom Mackenzie's gentle eyes. Upstairs, Tom sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his hat in his hands, staring out the window at the star-filled sky. He'd interacted with women before, of course, shopkeepers, the occasional traveler, but never had such a brief encounter left him feeling so unsettled. There had been something about Eleanor Hartwell, something in her green eyes and the graceful way she moved, that had stirred feelings he'd never experienced. He thought about the way she'd said his name, the slight tremor in her voice when she'd wished him good night. Was he imagining things, or had there been something more than mere politeness in her manner? As the night deepened and the town settled into sleep, both Tom and Ellie lay awake in their respective beds, each wondering about the other, each feeling the first stirrings of something that would soon grow beyond their ability to control or deny. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on the boarding-house windows. Ellie had been awake since before sunrise, taking unusual care with her appearance. She'd chosen her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and had allowed a few tendrils of hair to escape the severe bun she usually wore. She told herself it was simply good business practice to look presentable for her guests, but the flutter in her stomach suggested otherwise. Tom appeared in the dining room precisely at 7, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. The sight of him in the morning light confirmed what Ellie had suspected the night before. He was indeed a remarkably handsome man, with an air of quiet strength that was both comforting and exciting. "Good morning, Mr. Mackenzie," she said, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits before him. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Tom replied honestly, and the way his eyes met hers suggested he wasn't talking only about the comfortable bed. As Tom ate, Ellie found excuses to linger in the dining room, refilling his coffee cup, adjusting the curtains, wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. They spoke of simple things, the weather, the quality of the lumber business, the growth of Cedar Ridge. But beneath the mundane conversation, something deeper was building. "You live alone out there in the woods?" Ellie asked, settling into the chair across from him with her own cup of coffee. Tom nodded. 5 years now. "It suits me, mostly. He looked up from his plate, and Ellie saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Gets quiet sometimes. A man can get too used to his own company." "I understand that feeling," Ellie said softly. "Running this place, I'm surrounded by people coming and going, but it's not the same as having someone who stays." Their eyes met across the small table, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Tom felt his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the strong coffee, while Ellie found herself imagining what it might be like to have this gentle giant of a man as more than just a temporary guest. "I should be getting back," Tom said finally, though he made no move to rise from his chair. "Of course," Ellie replied, though disappointment colored her voice. "Will you, that is, do you come to town often?" "Once a month, usually. For supplies?" "Well then," Ellie said, gathering her courage, "you'll always have a room here if you need one." Tom stood slowly, reaching into his pocket for payment. As he placed the coins in Ellie's palm, his fingers brushed against hers, and both of them felt the spark of that contact like a small lightning strike. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell," Tom said, his voice rougher than before. "For everything." After Tom left, Ellie found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. She burned the noon meal, forgot to change the linens in room 3, and caught herself staring out the window in the direction Tom had taken when he left town. The other guests, a traveling preacher and an elderly woman visiting her daughter, seemed to sense her distraction but were too polite to comment. Meanwhile, Tom drove his wagon back toward his cabin with his mind in turmoil. The solitude that had once been his refuge now felt oppressive. Every familiar landmark reminded him of his isolation, and for the first time in years, he found himself questioning the life he'd built in the wilderness. That evening, as Ellie sat in her small parlor with a book she couldn't focus on, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would write to Tom. It wasn't proper, perhaps, but propriety had never brought her anything but loneliness. She had no idea where exactly his cabin was located, but she knew he sold lumber to Henderson's mill. Surely they would know how to reach him. The letter she composed was carefully worded, ostensibly about business. She mentioned that she might need some custom woodwork done for the boarding house, but between the lines was an invitation, a reaching out from one lonely soul to another. Tom received the letter a week later when he came to the mill to deliver a load of timber. Henderson handed it to him with a knowing grin. "Seems you made quite an impression in town, Mackenzie." That night, by the light of his oil lamp, Tom read Ellie's letter 3 times. The formal language couldn't disguise the warmth behind it, and he found himself smiling for the first time in days. He spent the better part of the evening composing his reply, his large hands struggling with the delicate work of penmanship, but determined to match her eloquence. Thus began a correspondence that would span the next month. Letters traveled back and forth between the boarding house and the cabin, each one growing slightly more personal, slightly more revealing. Ellie wrote about her dreams of traveling, of seeing the ocean, of reading every book ever written. Tom shared his love of the forest, his satisfaction in creating something useful with his hands, his memories of his parents and the life he'd left behind in Ohio. With each letter, the attraction between them deepened into something more substantial, understanding, respect, and a growing affection that neither had expected to find at this stage of their lives. It was in early November that Tom made another trip to town, ostensibly for supplies, but really because he could no longer bear the separation. This time, when he knocked on Ellie's door, she opened it with a smile that lit up her entire face. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, and there was genuine joy in her voice. "How wonderful to see you, Miss Hartwell," he replied, and the way he said her name was like a caress. This visit was different from the first. Tom stayed for 3 days, helping Ellie with repairs around the boarding house that she'd mentioned in her letters. He fixed a loose step on the front porch, replaced a broken window in the kitchen, and built her a new set of shelves for her books. As they worked together, their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by shared laughter and meaningful glances. On the second evening, as they sat in the parlor after the other guests had retired, Ellie found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Tom," she said, using his first name for the first time, "why have you never married?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling in the small fireplace. "I suppose I never found the right woman," he said finally. "And living the way I do, isolated. It didn't seem fair to ask someone to share that kind of life." "And now?" Ellie asked softly. Tom turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a longing that matched her own. "Now I'm beginning to think that maybe the right woman might make that life worth sharing." The air between them grew thick with unspoken desire. Ellie felt her heart pounding as Tom rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat on the small sofa. When he sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, she thought she might faint from the intensity of her feelings. "Ellie," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something. I've never. That is, I don't have experience with women." The confession hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Ellie reached out and placed her hand over his, marveling at the size and strength of it. "And I," she said, matching his honesty with her own, "have never been with a man. We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Tom's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Ellie, I think I'm falling in love with you. I think I fell in love with you the moment you walked through my door," she whispered back, when Tom leaned down to kiss her. It was with the reverence of a man touching something precious and fragile. Ellie's lips were soft and warm beneath his, and when she responded, kissing him back with a passion that surprised them both, Tom felt as though his entire world had shifted on its axis. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, both aware that they stood at a crossroads that would define the rest of their lives. "Ellie," Tom said, his forehead resting against hers, "I want to be with you, truly be with you, but I don't want to dishonor you." Ellie looked into his eyes, seeing the desire there, but also the respect and love that made her feel cherished rather than merely wanted. "Tom Mackenzie," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm 32 years old and I've spent my entire life being proper and respectable and alone. Tonight I don't want to be alone anymore." The decision, once made, seemed to charge the very air around them with electricity. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he helped Ellie to her feet, both of them acutely aware of the magnitude of what they were about to share. The boarding house was quiet around them. The other guests long since retired, leaving them in a bubble of intimacy that felt both thrilling and sacred. "Are you certain?" Tom asked, his voice husky with desire but still gentle, still giving her the chance to change her mind. In response, Ellie took his hand and led him toward the stairs, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate and meaningful. When they reached the landing, Ellie paused outside her own room, something she had never done before, never even considered doing. But Tom McKenzie had awakened something in her that refused to be denied any longer. Her room was smaller than the guest rooms, but it was entirely hers. A patchwork quilt her grandmother had made covered the narrow bed, and books were stacked on every available surface. The space smelled faintly of lavender and the rosewater she used in her hair. Tom stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in this intimate glimpse into Ellie's private world. The sight of her hairbrush on the small vanity, her nightgown folded neatly on the chair, the way the moonlight streamed through her lace curtains, it all seemed impossibly precious to him. "Tom," Ellie said softly, turning to face him. In the silvery light she looked ethereal, beautiful in a way that took his breath away. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch seeming to seal them away from the rest of the world. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, both nervous, both excited, both overwhelmed by the intensity of their feelings. "I don't know what I'm doing," Tom admitted, his honesty endearing him to her even more. "Neither do I," Ellie replied, stepping closer to him. "But I know I want to learn. With you." When Tom reached for her this time, his movements were sure despite his inexperience. His hands found the pins in her hair, removing them one by one until her auburn locks fell in waves around her shoulders. Ellie had never felt more beautiful than she did in that moment, seeing herself reflected in Tom's wondering eyes. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his fingers threading through her hair. "I can't believe you're real." Ellie's hands went to the buttons of his shirt, her fingers working with surprising steadiness despite the trembling in her heart. "I've dreamed of this," she confessed, "of being touched, of being wanted. But I never imagined it could feel like this." "Like what?" Tom asked, his breath catching as her hands spread across his chest. "Like coming home," she whispered. Their lovemaking was tender and exploratory, two people discovering not just each other's bodies, but the profound intimacy that comes from complete trust and acceptance. Tom's touch was reverent, almost worshipful, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Ellie responded to him with a passion that surprised them both, her body awakening to sensations she had only read about in her secret novels. There was awkwardness, of course, fumbled buttons, nervous laughter, moments of uncertainty, but there was also wonder and tenderness, and a growing confidence as they learned each other's rhythms and responses. When Tom finally made her truly his, Ellie cried out not in pain but in joy, feeling complete for the first time in her life. Afterward, they lay entwined in her narrow bed, Tom's large frame somehow fitting perfectly against her smaller one. Ellie rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, while Tom's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "What happens now?" Ellie asked softly, voicing the question that hung between them. Tom was quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling in her hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know I don't want this to be just one night. I know I can't go back to my cabin and pretend this didn't happen, pretend I don't love you." Ellie lifted her head to look at him, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. "Then don't," she said simply. "Don't go back. Not alone, Ellie, my life. It's not easy. The cabin is small, isolated. You'd be giving up everything. Your business, your independence, the life you've built here." Ellie considered this, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking, what she was considering. "Tom, I've spent 32 years building a life that was safe and respectable and utterly empty. Tonight, you've shown me what it means to truly live. I don't want to go back to merely existing." Tom's arms tightened around her, and she could feel the emotion in his voice when he spoke. "Are you saying you'd come with me? Leave all this behind?" "I'm saying I love you," Ellie replied, the words coming easily now that she'd found the courage to speak them. "And love means being willing to build a new life together, wherever that might be." They talked through the night, making plans, sharing dreams, discussing the practical realities of combining their lives. Tom spoke of expanding his cabin, of the garden Ellie could plant, of the children they might have. Ellie talked about the books she would bring, the way she could help with his business, the life they could create together in the wilderness. As dawn approached, painting the sky in soft pastels outside Ellie's window, they made love again, this time with the confidence of lovers who knew they belonged together, who had found in each other not just passion but partnership. "I'll need time to settle my affairs here," Ellie said as they lay watching the sunrise. "Find someone to take over the boarding house, pack my things." "How long?" Tom asked, already dreading the separation. "A month, perhaps 2. I want to do this properly, leave things in good order." Tom nodded, understanding her need to be responsible even as his heart rebelled against the delay. "I'll come back for you," he promised. "And in the meantime I'll prepare the cabin, make it worthy of you." "It's already worthy," Ellie said, kissing his chest where her head had been resting. "Because it's yours." When Tom finally left that morning, both of them knew that everything had changed. The shy lumberjack and the resigned spinster were gone, replaced by 2 people who had found in each other the courage to reach for happiness, regardless of what society might think. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. True to her word, Ellie threw herself into the task of settling her affairs with characteristic efficiency. She found a young widow named Sarah Mitchell, who was eager to take over the boarding house, and spent days teaching her the intricacies of the business, which guests preferred their eggs scrambled versus fried, how to get the best prices from the local suppliers, the importance of keeping the rooms spotlessly clean. Meanwhile, Tom worked with an energy and purpose he'd never felt before. He expanded his cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. He built shelves for Ellie's books, crafted a rocking chair for the front porch, and even attempted to create a small garden plot, though he admitted in his letters that he knew nothing about flowers and would need her expertise come spring. Their correspondence during this period was constant and passionate. Tom's letters, initially stilted and formal, became increasingly intimate as he grew more comfortable expressing his feelings on paper. He wrote about his dreams for their future, his plans for the cabin, his growing impatience to have her in his arms again. Ellie's letters were equally revealing. She wrote about her excitement at the prospect of their life together, her nervousness about leaving the only home she'd known as an adult, and her absolute certainty that she was making the right choice. She also wrote about the reactions of the townspeople to her decision. "Mrs. Patterson thinks I've lost my mind," she wrote in one letter. "She can't understand why I would give up my secure situation for what she calls a life of hardship in the wilderness. But Tom, when I think about waking up beside you every morning, about building something real and lasting together, I know that what I'm leaving behind isn't security, it's just a beautiful prison." The night before Tom was to come for her, Ellie stood in her nearly empty room, looking around at the space that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. Most of her belongings were already packed. Her books, her clothes, the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother. Tomorrow she would begin an entirely new chapter of her life. Sarah Mitchell knocked softly on the doorframe. "Miss Hartwell?" "There's someone here to see you." Ellie's heart leaped, thinking Tom might have arrived early, but when she reached the parlor, she found Mrs. Patterson waiting for her, along with several other prominent women from the town. "Eleanor," Mrs. Patterson began, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we've come to talk sense into you. This foolishness has gone on long enough." Ellie straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Patterson. This ridiculous notion of running off with that woodsman. Eleanor, you're a respectable woman with a good business. You can't throw it all away for some romantic fantasy." "It's not a fantasy," Ellie replied calmly. "It's love. And it's my choice to make." Mrs. Henderson, the doctor's wife, stepped forward. "Eleanor, dear, you're not thinking clearly. What do you really know about this man? He could be anyone, could have any sort of past." "I know he's kind and gentle and honest," Ellie said. "I know he makes me feel alive in a way I never have before. And I know that I'd rather face uncertainty with him than spend another day in the safety of loneliness." The women exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by her resolve. Mrs. Patterson made one last attempt. "Eleanor, if you do this, there's no coming back. You'll be ruined in the eyes of decent society." Ellie smiled, and there was something in her expression that made the women step back slightly. "Mrs. Patterson, I've spent my entire life trying to meet the expectations of decent society, and where has it gotten me? 32 years old and alone, considered a failure because I never managed to catch a husband. Well, I've caught one now and I intend to keep him." The women left in a huff, but Ellie felt only relief. She had faced down the judgment of her community and emerged stronger for it. Tom arrived the next morning with a wagon to carry her belongings, and the sight of him, tall and strong and smiling with pure joy at seeing her, erased any lingering doubts Ellie might have had. He swept her into his arms right there on the front porch, spinning her around while she laughed with delight. "Ready to go home, Mrs. McKenzie?" he asked, and Ellie's heart soared at the sound of her new name. "I've been ready my whole life," she replied. The journey to Tom's cabin took most of the day, winding through forests that grew thicker and more beautiful with each mile. Ellie marveled at the towering pines, the crystal-clear streams, the way the afternoon light filtered through the canopy above them. This would be her world now, and she found it more magnificent than she had ever imagined. When they finally reached the cabin, Ellie gasped in amazement. Tom had transformed the simple structure into something that looked like a real home. Flower boxes waited beneath the windows for spring planting, a stone chimney promised warmth during the cold mountain winters, and the front porch with its new rocking chair looked like the perfect place to spend quiet evenings together. "Tom, it's beautiful," she breathed, and the pride in his eyes made her heart swell with love. That night, as they lay in their marriage bed, for they had been wed by the traveling preacher just before leaving town, Ellie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been resigned to spinsterhood, convinced that love and passion were not meant for her. Now she was a wife, a partner, a woman who had found the courage to reach for happiness and claim it. "Any regrets?" Tom asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Ellie turned in his arms, studying his face in the firelight. "Only that it took us so long to find each other." Tom's response was to kiss her with all the passion and tenderness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning, and Ellie knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The isolation was sometimes difficult, especially during the long winter months. There were times when supplies ran low, when illness struck, when the harsh realities of frontier life tested their resolve. But through it all they had each other. Ellie proved to be remarkably adaptable to her new life. She learned to tend a garden, to preserve food for the winter, to help Tom with his lumber business. She established a small lending library for the scattered families in the area, and her cabin became a gathering place for the few women who lived within traveling distance. Tom, for his part, blossomed under Ellie's love and companionship. The shy, awkward man who had been afraid to speak to women became confident and outgoing. He expanded his business, eventually employing several other men, and becoming one of the most successful lumber operations in the territory. 3 years after their marriage, Ellie gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hope. 2 years later came a son, Thomas Jr., and then another daughter, Grace. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of family life, children's laughter, Ellie singing as she worked, Tom's deep voice reading stories by the fire. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on their front porch, watching their children play in the yard, Tom took Ellie's hand in his. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't needed a room that night?" he asked. Ellie smiled, her hair now showing more silver, but her eyes as bright as ever. "I think we would have found each other eventually. Some things are just meant to be like us, especially like us," she replied, leaning over to kiss the man who had transformed her from a lonely spinster into a beloved wife and mother. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Tom and Ellie McKenzie sat surrounded by the life they had built together, a life that had begun with a single night of courage and had grown into a love story that would be told for generations. Their story became legend in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding areas, the tale of the shy lumberjack and the town spinster who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to defy convention and create their own happiness. It was a reminder that love doesn't follow society's timeline, that it's never too late to find your person, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest acts of faith. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask about how they met, Ellie would always smile and say, "Your grandfather needed a room for the night, and I needed someone to fill the empty spaces in my heart." It turned out we were exactly what each other was looking for, and Tom would add, with a twinkle in his eye, "Sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them, but when you're brave enough to reach for them anyway." Their love story proved that it's never too late for a first love, never too late to take a chance on happiness, and never too late to discover that the life you thought you were settling for was just the beginning of the life you were meant to live. If this story of unexpected love and second chances touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of romance, courage, and the power of love to transform lives. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe it's never too late to find true love? Share your thoughts below.